مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الوقت يمر بسرعة. أثناء تصوير حلقتنا هذه لا يزال ممثلو البيت الأبيض والقادة الجمهوريون في الكونغرس يتفاوضون بخصوص أزمة سقف الديون. إذا فشل التفاوض فمن الممكن أن تعجز الولايات المتحدة عن سداد ديونها لأول مرة في تاريخها. لا أحد يستطيع التنبؤ بمدى تأثير ذلك على الاقتصاد الأمريكي أو على قيمة الدولار، العملة التي يفضلها الناس أكثر من غيرها في كل أنحاء العالم. هل هذه مجرد لعبة سياسية؟ هل يدمر السياسيون اقتصادنا بسبب قرار سيء؟ هذا الاقتصاد الذي عرف بأنه نابض بالحياة وتم بناؤه عن طريق أجيال من الأمريكيين. إذا حدث هذا الأمر فمن سيلوم الشعب الأمريكي؟ هل سيلوم الرئيس الديمقراطي؟ أم سيلوم الجمهوريين الذين يسيطرون على الكونغرس؟ هل اللوم على غباء نظام يسمح أصلاً بحدوث ذلك؟ لمناقشة سياسة أزمة سقف الديون يسعدني أن أرحب بفريق من المراقبين السياسيين البارزين سارة فارس وكايل كونديك وجيسيكا تايلور. Welcome back to داخل Washington. It is one of the most obscure but important moments in American politics, a moment that is filled with implication for the fate of the American economy. We're talking about the negotiation over the future of the debt limit. Why do we have a debt limit? What are the politics? And where is this all going in terms of American domestic, economic, and political future? Well, I'm delighted to welcome Kyle Kondik and Sarah Ferris to help explain all this for our viewers abroad. All right, Sarah, can you take a moment and just explain to our viewers what is the debt limit and why does this matter?
Right. So this is basically a big political fight that we hear about every 2 or so years in Washington. It is basically, it always becomes a proxy fight for government spending and what is Washington spending its money on. But in reality, it's simply the U.S. borrowing limit. So this is money that has already been spent. And Congress simply needs to exercise its authority to raise this cap every time we hit the cap, which, as I said, it kind of differs, but it's usually about every 2 years. And this is something that both parties have tried to use leverage on. As long as I've been in Washington, I've been covering this for about 10 years. And I've seen the last really, really big fight was in 2011. I was not here for that one, but that was the real fight that sparked a downgrade of the U.S. debt for the first time. And this is the kind of comparison that we're hearing now, that things are getting about as risky as it did back then, with just both sides really entrenched in their positions. So it does get messy every couple of years, especially in divided government as we have now. And what should be a pretty routine exercise, money that's already been spent, money that's already been agreed to, always becomes an enormous fight about the future.
So, Kyle, again, Sarah said this is not the first time we've had this sort of dispute. How have these disputes been settled in the past? Is America unique here? I mean, do other countries do the same thing every couple of years too, or is this a special aspect of American exceptionalism?
I can't speak to other countries, although it is kind of odd that we have this mechanism in which the debt limit has to be raised, even though, as Sarah said, the spending has already been authorized. And so it in some ways, I think it's sort of this relic. And I think sometimes there's discussion as to whether it should just be done away with, in the longer term, so that we don't have these debilitating fights every few years. And while the United States has not defaulted on its debt over the course of these fights in the past, it is reasonable, I think, to worry, particularly if you are somebody who maybe holds some sort of obligation from the U.S. government that, would we default at some point? Are we, good to pay our bills? I mean, the United States is the, I think, cornerstone of the international economy. And if we did have a default, there would probably be, widespread and probably negative consequences. But these battles typically do get resolved historically. You could go back for decades in terms of the debt limit being used as something of like a political chess piece. There was when Reagan was president in the early 80s, the Democrats withheld some votes on the debt limit, although of course it was raised at that time. And but I feel like it's been sort of a steady build to this point where President Biden has said, "Hey, we're not going to negotiate over the debt limit," but basically they are negotiating over the debt limit. And it's it's a move by House Republicans or Republicans in general to try to extract some concessions. Of course, the Republicans and Democrats have vastly different ideas as to the size and scope of government.
So again, just to remind everybody, what's at stake here is something that is written on the dollar bill, the full faith and credit of the United States government, and whether or not that dollar will be backed by the United States Treasury, which will pay its debts, pay its bonds, pay what it has promised to pay, what it has actually already spent in terms of borrowing money. And so it's a big issue for the economy. What do Republicans want? Why do they think that they're going to get it by using the debt limit as a political tool, Sarah?
So basically, ever since Republicans took back the House, as they did last November, their party has been itching for a chance to have a showdown with Democrats. Democrats hold the White House, they hold the Senate. This is the first time that something has to be passed into law. This is the first time that there is an actual requirement that Democrats have to come to the table. They've passed plenty of messaging bills. Now this is when Democrats actually have to come to the table. So Republicans are using this opportunity to, right now they're pushing for about $131 billion in spending cuts. They basically want to go back to pre-pandemic spending levels. And so over time, that's about $131 billion. Democrats right now are talking about, we're not willing to go below a freeze in spending levels. So they're willing to freeze it, but not go below it. And just this simple math fight over spending levels is absolutely consuming Washington. And it's really to the point where this has become, even if this is resolved, this particular issue is resolved on the debt fight, it's going to come back up when we talk about spending in September. It's going to come back up when there's another spending fight next year. We have at least another 2 years of this while Speaker Kevin McCarthy is in charge and while President Joe Biden is in charge. So right now, spending is the big one. There's also other requirements. They want to see stricter rules for social programs. Republicans are pushing more work requirements for programs like Medicaid, for the Federal Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. These are things the Democrats say are complete non-starters. So these are some of the issues that they've been talking about in the halls of the Capitol for the last several weeks now.
And we're welcomed by Jessica Taylor. Delightful to have you join the panel as well. Jessica, when we think about this this face-off between Capitol Hill and the White House, is the Senate a key player as well, or is this really House Republicans versus Joe Biden?
I mean, right now it does seem to be more of a House versus the White House thing, but this still has to pass the Senate. I mean, I think that the emphasis seems to be on working out a framework first that can pass the House, and largely that seems to be focused on sort of more centrist, middle of the road establishment members of both sides, because some of the, fringes of both parties, more progressives and more House Freedom Caucus might not support something. But I mean, it's got to move to the Senate, and it's got to move very quickly. I mean, we're rapidly approaching sort of the D-Day. And so, I mean, again, Democrats have a 1-seat majority. They thankfully do have, they're very grateful that they now do have Dianne Feinstein back. That was causing a, big issue for them, especially in passing discussing judicial nominees earlier because of her health. But you also have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema that Democrats rely on as votes. While Sinema's an independent now, she still caucuses with Democrats, and who knows what they could inject in it, because we've seen them do that with, the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure and different things. And, Manchin has been very big on permitting reform and different things too, that has been part of this. So it's a lot. It's a lot to sort of balance when you have a very closely divided Senate and House.
And Kyle, when you look at the White House's approach to this, is President Biden calling the Republican bluff, saying, you guys tank the economy if you choose? Or is he actually negotiating with them on some of the items that are on the Republican agenda?
I do think the White House position has sort of shifted here a little bit, because they kind of said they weren't going to negotiate on this. And then there's also this sort of rhetorical sleight of hand going on where it's like, we're not negotiating over the debt limit, but maybe we're negotiating over the budget. So that's how you get the debt limit to be raised. I mean, it's kind of it can be kind of like a convoluted thing to try to follow. There are also people both on the left and also just, analyst types who believe that the president essentially has the authority through, various mechanisms to raise the debt limit unilaterally, or to basically just mint money to cover the debt and that sort of thing. And you do wonder if at some point in one of these fights that someone president will just exercise this option and basically take it to the courts and see if they can do it or not. And then if that happens, maybe these fights over the debt limit go away. But it doesn't seem like the White House has wanted to pursue that, even though there are, some people within the Democratic Party who do want to do that. I would assume, if a Republican were ever in this position, they might consider that sort of option too, if they felt like they were getting unreasonable demands from the other side in order to raise the debt limit.
Actually, so I was eventually going to ask the panel about this. So let me ask you now, Sarah. Some suggest that there is a neat constitutional solution invoking the terms of the 14th Amendment, which, the Civil War era change to our Constitution. Well, what is that? And if it's so smart, why haven't presidents used this solution to address this problem at earlier times?
Well, you get a sense for how little trust Democrats have in Speaker Kevin McCarthy to actually land a deal, that they are talking about something like this. This has never happened before in previous debt limit discussions. Why it's coming up now is because there are a lot of Democrats in both the House and the Senate who truly don't think a deal can be reached. And they are at such a point of desperation, they can't do anything. There is nothing that can come to the floor and pass either chamber with the amount of Democrats in the chambers right now. They don't have enough support for it. So they're looking at, like Kyle said, these unilateral measures like the 14th Amendment. There's a couple of other, slightly more offbeat ideas, minting $1 trillion coin, these sorts of things, simply because there aren't any other options available. And the president, my company Politico has reported that the White House has told many of those on the left, many Democrats, that this is simply not an option that they're considering. There's been a lot of economists who've talked to members of Congress about this idea. They think it would wind up in the courts. Even if you can stave off default, they think it would still allow a lot of economic havoc. And we're still hearing Democrats talk about it. I talk to Democrats I've known a long time, and some of them seriously think this is the best option at this point. This is simply a symbol of the desperation and the distrust in Washington right now.
And before we go to the breaks, Jessica, I know that I've read some op-eds by some economists that say, oh, don't worry, the sky won't fall. It's not the end of the world. But what is the consensus among our nation's financial and economic experts about what would happen if we reach whatever date it is?
Yeah.
We don't have an agreement.
I mean, it's just unprecedented. We've never reached this. And this really does feel like the closest we've come to the brink before. I mean, the credit rating being downgraded and then which bills the government chooses to pay. I mean, you could have people not getting their Social Security payments, people not getting their Medicaid payments, doctors not getting their Medicare payments and things. I mean, it's just, where do they prioritize? They can talk about, and some members have pointed this out, well, the government would have enough to pay its interest, but the government has other bills other than the interest, and those are payments that directly affect consumers. And then all of this could have an impact on inflation still very high and interest rates continuing to rise. What could this do to the housing markets? I mean, this is just all very unprecedented, which I feel like is something that a word that we use routinely now in politics, but that's just really the truth. And I'm not really surprised we've gotten to this point when you look back at certainly the speaker election, the 15 ballots that it took to come to that. I mean, this is just, with as divided a Congress as this is, it's just hard to come to any to any agreement really and things. And so things are often pushed to the brink, and this is sort of the brinkiest of the brink that we have been.
So in the end, if this does not succeed, some people won't be getting their checks.
It's very possible
from the U.S. government.
It's
All
very
right, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at what actually the elements of a deal may look like and who will get blamed: Republicans, Democrats, Joe Biden, Kevin McCarthy, if indeed we go over the brink. In just a moment. Joining us on Dakhel Washington is Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers Congress for Politico, a multimedia platform that is all politics all the time. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she has also reported for The Hill and The Washington Post. Also joining us is Kyle Kondik. Kyle is managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. And he's the author of The Bellwether, a book about the state of Ohio and its presidential voting history, a state that frequently reflects and correctly predicts national election outcomes. And on our panel today is Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and she's the senior author of the 2022 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, Jessica was political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. So, Kyle, not everyone can win every political fight. There are some winners, some losers. Ultimately, I think most people think ultimately there will be an agreement that creates a new debt limit. If that happens, Republicans are likely to be forced to blink. How do they extract vengeance? What comes next, if indeed there is an agreement?
Well, look, it sort of depends on the actual structure of the agreement. I mean, I think that, one possible outcome is that, there could be some sort of deal cut in which Democrats and the left feel like they've given up too much. But on the other hand, maybe that actually makes Biden look good to centrist voters because he can point to budget cuts or whatever as he tries to run for re-election. I will say that in these sort of fights, the Republicans are the ones that are using the debt limit basically in exchange for something. And so the sort of status quo would just be to pass a clean debt limit hike and just move on. I think when you're the side that is, actually asking for something that if there is a default or a some sort of disruption, I think it's easier to blame the side that actually wants to change the status quo as opposed to the side, in this case, the Democrats, who just want to pass the debt limit increase and move on. So that may have some role in the fallout of this. But the other thing, too, is that, we're still pretty far from an election. That's coming up nationally in November 2024. Presidential primary season doesn't start until early 2024. That calendar is still in flux, but probably not until January or February. And so it's possible that, as with so many other big fights in American politics, that this will be a huge deal for a time and then it'll kind of fade away and then something else will end up replacing it. Although, as Sarah mentioned, it's not like this is going to be the only budget-related fight that we have between now and the next election. There are other things coming along, and maybe even another debt limit increase fight potentially, depending on how long this, whatever gets passed ends up being in place.
Republicans think that they have the upper hand here and that they think they have the public on their side. Obviously, they won the House last year. So, Democrats, as we've been talking about, it's going to end up being a messaging game.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Kyle Kondik, Sarah Ferris, Jessica Taylor, thank you very much for helping to explain this arcane but very important issue to our viewers abroad. Thank you for joining me on Dakhel Washington. Dakhel Washington, this show, is mainly about Washington. American politics, American policy, and the connection between them. Although we beam out to the Arab world, the focus of the show is almost always about what happens here, not what happens there. Sometimes, however, I make an exception, and this is one of those times. That's because something has occurred in the region that has stirred my consciousness as an American, and more broadly, as a citizen of the world, something that requires me to speak out. I am talking about the political rehabilitation of Syria's Bashar al-Assad, the man singularly responsible for the murder of 500,000 of his countrymen, the exile or dislocation of half the country's population, the loss of a generation of Syrian youth, and the physical destruction of one of the world's oldest, proudest, and noblest countries. I am neither naive to the ways of the world nor ignorant of America's own historical dealing with some of the world's worst tyrants, killers, and despots. I know that we sometimes have to hold our nose, swallow our morality, and work with objectionable characters for the sake of the greater good. Nothing exemplified this more than our wartime alliance, the one that Roosevelt and Churchill had with Stalin, who was responsible for the deaths of millions, or Nixon's strategic embrace of Chairman Mao, who was probably responsible for even more deaths in China than Stalin was in Russia. But there were vital, sound, and urgent reasons why those leaders did their deals with the devil. In Stalin's case, to win the Second World War. In Mao's case, to prevent a third. Why Arab leaders have put out the welcome mat for Assad, hugging and kissing him and his wife, welcoming his return to the Arab League, listening politely as he repeated turgid drivel to the assembled leaders in Jeddah, makes much less sense. Nothing, it seems, was really asked of Assad as recompense for his rehabilitation, and nothing was offered. And if anyone thinks Assad is now going to chuck his partnership with the Iranians, allies to him and his father through thick and thin for the past 40 years, for the sake of his newfound Arab friends, well, they must be smoking something other than tobacco in their nargilas. This largely Arab story does have an American angle, and it's in the form of congressional legislation recently proposed to strengthen our already tough sanctions on Syria. A bipartisan group of legislators has proposed the Assad Anti-Normalization Act, designed to hold the Assad regime and its backers accountable for the crimes against the Syrian people, and to deter further normalization with the Assad regime. It would not only prevent the US government from following suit and normalizing ties with Assad, but it would step up pressure against any country from investing in, supporting, or giving assistance to the butcher of Damascus. Now, by long-standing policy, I do not endorse specific pieces of legislation. So here I will limit myself to urging all viewers just to take a close look at what this broad base of Congress people is proposing. I do think they're onto something. When the stakes are low, the advantage is minimal, and the benefits virtually non-existent, as appears the case, we should all think twice and even 3 times before we cloak a killer like Assad in the mantle of redemption. I hope friends of America, who are leaders of the Arab world, are watching. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بعافية الاقتصاد الأمريكي بعد 3 سنوات من بدء انتشار جائحة كورونا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك حين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.